They called it policy, but policy is often the safest mask bias can wear. It doesn't raise its voice, it doesn't use slurs, and it doesn't announce its intentions. It simply hides behind printed rules and rehearsed phrases, delivered with calm authority. In the airline lounge, the staff spoke politely, professionally, and confidently, as if courtesy alone could cleanse injustice. When they approached the black CEO, there was no hesitation, no visible doubt, just an assumption quietly reinforced by years of unchecked norms. To them, authority looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, and fit a familiar image that did not include the man sitting calmly in the VIP seat. The rule they claimed to enforce had existed long before this moment, but the way it was applied revealed far more than the words written on paper. Bias doesn't always come dressed as anger. Sometimes it arrives as efficiency. The staff believed they were doing their jobs, moving quickly to resolve what they saw as a simple seating issue. Yet no one asked the obvious questions. No one verified credentials. No one considered the possibility that the man they were addressing had earned his place through success that exceeded everyone else in the room. Instead, the decision was made instantly, guided by an internal hierarchy shaped by appearance and skin color. Policy became the shield that protected them from questioning their own instincts. After all, if the rule says someone must move, then responsibility feels shared, diluted, almost invisible. Around them, passengers watched. Some avoided eye contact, afraid that involvement might inconvenience their own journey. Others smiled uncomfortably, treating the situation as mild entertainment rather than a public stripping of dignity. Silence filled the space, and silence has a way of validating injustice. In moments like these, bias doesn't need defenders. It only needs witnesses who choose comfort over courage. The staff continued speaking, repeating policy language like a script, unaware that every word widened the gap between procedure and humanity. What makes silent bias especially dangerous is how reasonable it appears. There were no raised voices, no threats, no overt cruelty. Just a request, just a rule, just a decision. But beneath that calm surface was a message that landed heavily. You do not belong here. Your presence is temporary. Your status is conditional. The CEO felt it instantly, not because this was his first encounter with such treatment, but because it followed a pattern he had seen throughout his life. Bias has a familiar rhythm, and once you recognize it, you can hear it even when it whispers. The staff believed they were neutral, but neutrality is impossible when systems are uneven. Choosing not to question the rule is still a choice, and choosing not to see the person in front of you is still an act of judgment. Policy, when stripped of context, becomes a weapon that targets the most convenient subject. In that moment, the black CEO was not seen as an individual with a story, achievements, and authority. He was reduced to a problem that needed solving quickly so operations could continue smoothly. This is how discrimination survives in modern spaces. It evolves, it adapts, and it hides behind professionalism. It learns the language of corporate ethics and customer service, presenting itself as fairness while delivering inequality. The staff likely believed they would be praised for following protocol, for resolving a conflict efficiently. What they did not realize was that efficiency without empathy often replicates injustice faster than malice ever could. The humiliation was subtle but profound. Being asked to move in front of strangers, being questioned without cause, being spoken to as though explanation was a privilege rather than a right. Each second carried the weight of unspoken assumptions. And yet, the CEO remained composed, not because he accepted the treatment, but because he understood something the room did not. He knew that power does not always need to argue immediately. Sometimes it waits, observing how bias reveals itself when it thinks it is protected by rules. Silent bias thrives when no one challenges it, when policies are treated as sacred texts rather than tools meant to serve people. It grows stronger in spaces where appearance is mistaken for authority and confidence is mistaken for entitlement. In that airline lounge, the real issue was never seating. It was the unchecked belief that some people must always justify their presence, while others are assumed to belong. Assumptions are quick, quiet, and often invisible, but their cost is always paid in full by the person on the receiving end. In the airline lounge, the assumption was made long before a word was spoken. It formed the moment the staff scanned the room and decided who looked like they belonged in a VIP seat and who did not. Skin color became a shortcut for judgment, a filter through which status, success, and legitimacy were measured. No evidence was required, no verification needed. The belief felt natural to those who held it, which is what made it so dangerous. The cost of such assumptions is not limited to embarrassment. It chips away at dignity. When the black CEO was singled out, he wasn't just asked to move seats. He was asked to justify his existence in a space he had rightfully earned. That demand carries a psychological weight that lingers far beyond the moment itself. It reminds you that no matter how far you climb, how much you achieve, or how impeccably you present yourself, there will always be someone ready to question your place based on nothing more than appearance. Assumptions based on skin color flatten complex lives into stereotypes. They erase years of education, sacrifice, leadership, and resilience, replacing them with a single, shallow narrative. In that lounge, the CEO's accomplishments were invisible because the assumption had already decided the story. He was not seen as a decision-maker, a leader, or a person of influence. He was seen as an inconvenience, an error in the system, someone occupying space meant for someone else. The emotional toll of that erasure is immense, because it forces a person to constantly prove what others are allowed to assume. These assumptions also expose how society assigns value. Whiteness is often treated as a default marker of authority, while blackness is treated as something that must be explained. This imbalance creates an unspoken hierarchy where some people are automatically trusted and others are automatically questioned. The airline staff did not intend to make a philosophical statement about race, but their actions reflected a deeply ingrained belief system that influences decisions in boardrooms, classrooms, hospitals, and courtrooms every day. The cost extends beyond the individual to the environment itself. When assumptions go unchecked, they teach everyone watching what is acceptable. Passengers who witnessed the exchange absorbed a silent lesson about who deserves respect and who can be challenged publicly. Even those who felt discomfort but remained silent contributed to the normalization of the moment. In this way, assumptions reproduce themselves, passed quietly from one observer to the next, shaping future behavior without ever being named. For the person targeted, the cost includes restraint. The CEO had to measure his response carefully, knowing that any display of frustration could reinforce the very stereotype being imposed on him. This emotional labor is rarely acknowledged. Remaining calm in the face of disrespect requires strength, not submission. It means carrying the burden of representing an entire group while being denied the individuality afforded to others. That burden is part of the price paid for assumptions rooted in skin color. Assumptions also distort fairness. They create situations where rules are enforced selectively, bent for some and rigid for others. If another passenger had been seated there, the interaction might have begun with curiosity rather than command. The assumption changed the tone, the language, and the outcome of the encounter. Fairness becomes performative when it depends on who is being addressed rather than what is actually true. There is also a cumulative cost that builds over time. Each incident, no matter how small it appears to outsiders, adds to a reservoir of lived experience that shapes how a person navigates the world. It influences how much trust they extend, how guarded they become, and how often they prepare for confrontation even in spaces meant for comfort. This constant vigilance is exhausting, and it is imposed unevenly along racial lines. Assumptions based on skin color do not simply misjudge individuals. They maintain systems that reward familiarity and punish difference. They allow people to feel justified without being just, confident without being correct. In that airline lounge, the assumption seemed harmless to those making it, a practical solution to a perceived problem. But for the man standing at its center, it was another reminder that the climb to success does not always end the scrutiny. It only changes the setting where it occurs. Public humiliation has a way of stripping a person down to their most vulnerable self, especially when it happens without warning and in front of strangers. In the airline lounge, the moment unfolded quietly, but the impact was loud. The request was made calmly, yet every ear nearby caught it. Every glance that followed turned the interaction into a spectacle. For the black CEO, this was not just an uncomfortable exchange with airline staff. It was a sudden spotlight placed on his identity, his worth, and his right to occupy that space. Humiliation does not need shouting to be effective. It only needs an audience. What made the moment heavier was the imbalance of power. The staff stood with institutional authority, backed by uniforms, policies, and the assumption of correctness. He stood alone, expected to comply, explain, or defend himself in front of people who had already formed opinions. In public settings, humiliation often works by forcing someone to choose between dignity and disruption. Speak up, and risk being labeled aggressive. Stay silent, and allow the narrative to move forward unchecked. That choice is never fair, yet it is imposed repeatedly on those who are most frequently questioned. Private strength is rarely visible in such moments, but it is always present. The CEO's calm was not accidental. It was practiced. It came from years of learning when to respond and when to wait, when to push back and when to let others reveal themselves. Strength, in this sense, is not loud resistance but controlled composure. It is the ability to stand steady while being misunderstood, to breathe through the weight of judgment without letting it dictate your behavior. Public humiliation seeks to provoke a reaction, because reactions can be used to justify the original mistreatment. If he raised his voice, it could be framed as confirmation of bias. If he complied too quickly, it could be seen as validation of the assumption that he did not belong. Navigating that narrow space requires emotional intelligence that is often demanded only of certain people. This unseen labor is part of what makes the strength private. Observers see silence or calm. They do not see the calculation, the restraint, or the self-awareness required to maintain it. There is also strength in refusing to internalize the humiliation. Public moments like these can easily become personal wounds, but the CEO understood that the discomfort said more about the system than about him. That understanding creates a boundary between who you are and how you are treated. It allows a person to experience the moment without letting it redefine their identity. Such strength is built over time, often through repeated exposure to similar situations, and it comes at a cost that is rarely acknowledged. The crowd plays a powerful role in public humiliation. Each onlooker becomes part of the environment that either intensifies or diffuses the moment. Silence from the crowd can feel like agreement, even when it is rooted in discomfort or fear of involvement. The CEO felt the weight of that silence, yet he did not allow it to shake his sense of self. Private strength means carrying yourself with the same confidence whether others affirm it or not. What makes this kind of strength remarkable is that it does not depend on immediate validation. The CEO did not need applause, defense, or recognition in that moment to know who he was. His authority did not come from the room. It came from his lived reality, his achievements, and his understanding of his own value. That internal grounding is what allowed him to remain composed while the situation unfolded. Public humiliation often aims to shrink a person, to make them feel smaller in front of others. Private strength does the opposite. It expands inward, reinforcing self-respect even when external respect is denied. The CEO's stillness was not submission. It was preparation. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knows that truth has a way of surfacing without being forced. Moments like this reveal an important contrast. Public humiliation is temporary, bound to the moment and the space in which it occurs. Private strength is enduring, carried from one experience to the next, shaping how a person responds to adversity. The audience may remember the awkwardness, the tension, or the silence, but they rarely remember the resilience required to withstand it. Yet that resilience is what ultimately determines how the story continues. Long after the lounge returns to its usual noise and movement, power is often misunderstood because people expect it to announce itself. They look for loud voices, commanding gestures, and visible symbols of control. In the airline lounge, power appeared invisible at first glance. The black CEO did not demand attention, did not reference his status, and did not attempt to dominate the situation. He sat quietly, observing how easily others assumed authority over him. To those watching, he seemed ordinary, perhaps even passive. But real power does not always reveal itself immediately, especially when it is rooted in confidence rather than performance. Unannounced power has a different texture. It is calm, measured, and patient. It does not rush to correct every misconception because it understands that not every moment requires explanation. The CEO's restraint was not a lack of agency. It was a deliberate choice shaped by experience. He understood that those who truly hold power are not threatened by being underestimated. In fact, underestimation often creates space for clarity, allowing others to expose their assumptions without interference. In many spaces, particularly corporate and institutional ones, power is associated with familiarity. It aligns with faces, accents, and behaviors that fit established expectations. Anyone who falls outside that frame is often required to perform their credibility. The CEO refused to perform. By not announcing who he was, he allowed the situation to unfold naturally, revealing how quickly authority is claimed by those who believe they own it. This quiet refusal challenged the unwritten rules of the space more effectively than confrontation might have. There is strength in letting silence speak. The staff continued to explain policy, unaware that their certainty was built on a false premise. Each word they spoke added to the contrast between perceived power and actual power. The CEO's stillness became a mirror, reflecting their assumptions back at them. In moments like this, power shifts subtly. It moves away from those who rely on position and toward those who possess self-assurance that does not depend on recognition. Unannounced power also disrupts expectations. People are conditioned to believe that influence must look a certain way, and when it doesn't, they fail to recognize it. This blindness allows individuals with true authority to move through spaces unnoticed, observing dynamics that others never see. The CEO's position afforded him a broader perspective. He could see not just the interaction itself, but the systems and beliefs that made it possible. That awareness is a form of power rarely acknowledged. The irony of invisible power is that it often becomes most visible at the moment of revelation. Until then, it remains underestimated, even dismissed. The CEO understood that timing matters. Declaring power too early can shut down learning, but allowing it to emerge naturally can transform the entire room. This patience is not passive. It is strategic. It reflects an understanding of human behavior and the psychology of authority. Many people feel compelled to assert themselves when challenged, fearing that silence will be mistaken for weakness. Yet unannounced power is not concerned with immediate impressions. It is grounded in internal certainty rather than external approval. The CEO did not need to convince anyone of his worth. He already knew it. That knowledge created a quiet stability that no policy or uniform could undermine. There is also a lesson in how institutions respond to unannounced power. Systems built on assumptions struggle when those assumptions are wrong. The staff believed they were in control because they had procedural backing. They did not consider the possibility that the person they were addressing held influence far beyond the scope of their authority. This disconnect highlights how fragile institutional power can be when it is not paired with humility and awareness. Unannounced power changes the energy of a situation without altering its surface. On the outside, nothing dramatic happens at first. On the inside, however, the balance is already shifting. The CEO's presence, though underestimated, carried weight that would soon reframe the entire interaction. His calm was not accidental. It was the foundation of his influence. When power does not announce itself, it invites others to reveal their true attitudes. It creates space for honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. In the airline lounge, that space exposed how quickly respect can be withdrawn when it is based on appearance rather than truth. And it set the stage for a moment when the invisible would become undeniable, not through force, but through the quiet certainty of someone who never needed to prove who he was. Revelation rarely arrives with drama at first. It often enters quietly, almost unnoticed, before it changes everything. In the airline lounge, the shift began the moment truth edged its way into the conversation. Until then, the atmosphere had been defined by assumption, procedure, and misplaced confidence. The staff believed they understood the situation completely, and the surrounding passengers had settled into passive observation. But truth has a way of unsettling certainty, especially when it contradicts the narrative people are comfortable believing. The moment of revelation was not just about identity or status. It was about the collapse of a false hierarchy. When it became clear who the man in the VIP seat actually was, the structure that had justified the humiliation began to crack. The same calm tone used to enforce policy faltered. Body language shifted. Certainty turned into hesitation. What moments earlier felt like unquestioned authority now looked fragile and exposed. Revelation does not need to raise its voice. It simply needs to exist. What makes such moments powerful is how quickly perspectives change. The CEO had not moved, raised his voice, or altered his demeanor. Yet the room transformed around him. This contrast revealed an uncomfortable truth. Respect had been conditional, offered only when power was recognized. The revelation did not CRE